If you've ever wondered what goes into building an all-wheel drive, K-swapped Civic, you've come to the right place. By the end of this heavily scripted video, you'll have all the specs, a full rundown of the work required to get it where it is today, and some of the things I've learned along the way. Plus, if you stick around to the end, I'll be pulling out the dyno graph, the corner balance results, and even a 60-second overview of the build sheet with all the juicy details. But first, let's dive right into this with a walk around. If you've watched any of my videos in the last year, you know this is my 1992 all-wheel drive Honda Civic. I've had the car since 2015, and like any project car, it's gone through a bunch of different versions to get where it is today. But that's maybe a story for another time. In a world where 1,000 horsepower K-Frank all-wheel drive Civics seem to be the benchmark of automotive drip, this car ironically seems to turn more heads by being naturally aspirated than anything. So let's start there, with the power plant. This is a low-mileage JDM K20A imported from Japan by the well-known Honda importer HMO, who I'm sure most of you have heard of. This engine is found in the Honda Accord Euro R, otherwise known as the CL7, and produces 217 horsepower and 152 pound-feet of torque from the factory, which is just barely enough to torque the lug nuts on my truck. It's a stock block, top to bottom, nothing done to it other than regular maintenance, and I gotta say, when she gets up past 8,000 RPM, it's glorious. Bolt-ons include a custom cold air intake I made out of 3-inch aluminum pipe, heat wrapped and capped off by a block 7-inch cone filter with a velocity stack. Exhaust is a Myers competition header, modified with a wireless control valve that tees off at the valve, which will eventually run under the car to a full exhaust. For now, it's straight out the fender, loud and proud. I did add a muffler insert to the dump pipe to take the edge off a little, but it's about as effective as a suppressor on a 50 cal, so there's that. For cooling, a K-tuned upper coolant housing and swivel thermostat, an old Yanaka half radiator with a SPAL fan and radium caps. I wired in a manual override switch for the fan for track days, which I'll show you when we get to the interior. It gets a little hot because I drive like a maniac, so I've got some cooling upgrades planned, but we'll get to that some other time. Other than that, I've got a basic catch can, hybrid racing center feed fuel rail and fuel pressure regulator, and stock injectors. But I'll get to the fuel system in a few minutes because there's a lot more to it you'll probably want to see. Let's move on to the transmission. Just like the engine, the trans came from Japan, courtesy of HMO. It's a 5-speed CRV unit that I've done a little work to. It's been refreshed with new bearings and seals all around, Honda fluid, a WaveTrack LSD, and stiffer Speed Factory detent springs to help give me those nice, crispy shifts. Finally, it's got a stage 2 clutch and lightened flywheel from Competition Clutch to put the power down. That rounds out the engine bay for now, so we'll move on down under the car to the drive line and check out the all-wheel drive system. Under the car, coming from the factory transfer case, we've got the front drive shaft with the slip yoke from a Civic wagon, which has just been shortened, upgraded to 1310 U-joints, and rebalanced. The viscous coupler is also from a Wago, rebuilt with 60K fluid by Trust Fab because who else? Viscous coupler mounts are a little unique. We've got Diamond Eye Fab weld-in brackets paired with Energy Tech mini mounts. I went that route because I wanted easy access for future maintenance. It's low profile, 4 bolts, and uses factory viscous coupler bearings. Looking back, I'd probably just do the S1 built mounting setup for cost effectiveness, but this works just as well. The rear drive shaft was built from scratch with the same treatment as the front, 1310 U-joints, and a balance. It was just cheaper to build one new than modify the old wagon rear shaft. That brings us to the rear diff, which is a stock Wago unit, open diff, unmolested other than new fluid. It's mounted with the FCS Racing diff mount, which I chose because it was possibly the only true bolt-in solution on the market back in 2019, and I wanted to install it myself. I was pretty meticulous with the measurements and the riv nuts, and it's held up great, no complaints. The rear brace bolts did back out a little on me once, which isn't surprising considering how I drive the car. So now I just use Loctite and don't have any issues. The axles are insane shafts 500 horsepower units on all 4 corners. For the rear trailing arms, we've got S1 built Alpha 6 arms, which are awesome. I may throw on a 5mm spacer though whenever I put a new set of summer tires on, because 225s do scrape a tad on the inside. You can see some rubber there on the arms. Next on the list is suspension. Starting from the rear end, we've got PCI toe links, eBay camber adjusters, and HCP lower control arms. I kind of mixed and matched the all-wheel drive components back here based on the look I wanted, because I wanted to stick with the black theme for most of the parts. Keep in mind, I started the all-wheel drive conversion in 2019 when the aftermarket support was still brand new for all-wheel drive swaps, so I was shopping around for a couple years as new parts were coming out. I had to modify the lower control arms a little bit to work with the S1 arms, but it's worked just fine. Coilovers are Progress CS3s with adjustable dampening. Spring rates are 450 pounds per inch in the front and 550 in the rear. That's equivalent to an 8K 10K split front to rear in metric units, which is firm but very streetable. I could definitely go stiffer, especially in the rear, but this was the recommended starting point by the guys at Progress for my specific setup and use case. The car handles pretty neutral and predictable in my opinion, tending toward understeer when the front tires get hot and squishy. There's just so much tire in the rear, I think I'm going to have to go full hard back there to get it to rotate more. If I could use a skinnier tire in the rear, I would, but there are almost no performance options in a 205/55 profile, which is what I would need to use to maintain the same tire circumference as the front. So the solution will have to be suspension and differential related. My other main theory, speaking of differentials, is that the open rear diff isn't pushing me through the corners when the inside rear wheel lifts, and that's causing some understeer. I prefer a lot of oversteer, so I'll be testing different spring rates on the track eventually. No one I know of really road races all-wheel drive Civics. Everyone seems to be straight line drag strip focused, so there's not a lot of data out there yet about current setups. Up front, I've got spoon extended ball joints, PCI adjustable outer tie rods, full race traction bars, and good old factory upper control arms. I replaced the manual steering rack guts with a Quaife unit for a quicker ratio, which definitely improved the feel on the track. I did a whole video on that, so check out that here if you're curious. Let's talk about brakes. This is a CX trim, so we got the tiny 9-inch rotors and factory single piston calipers up front. Rears are stock Integra units, 7 CLP13S calipers, and 9-inch rotors. I'm looking into a Porsche Boxster 986 caliper swap for the fronts, which will use Mini Cooper S rotors and a bracket kit from Hone Developments, so stay tuned for that at some point down the road. I've been experimenting with different pads, but currently for the winter we've got Dynamic Friction Street Performance pads up front and Hawk HPS pads on the rear that just never seem to wear out. I've got DTC 60s for when track season starts up again, so I'm looking forward to using those. There are no factory brake lines on this car. They've all been replaced with a full tuck braided line kit from Finishing Lines, which I really like. It simplified the whole system and really cleaned up the look in the engine bay and under the car. I was running a factory 3030 prop valve until just recently when I started having awful brake performance on the track, and I couldn't even lock up the brakes. Turns out it was leaking internally, so I scrapped it and installed a Willwood adjustable valve. The difference was just night and day, and now it stops like it should. I'm running with the brake booster disconnected because I like the feel of manual brakes, and it also counts as leg day if I'm at the track, so there's that. Running a bigger 15/16 master cylinder as well, which shortens the pedal travel, which I also prefer. I've plumbed in an inline hydro staging brake, which just holds the rear brakes. Not strictly necessary, but I like it for launching, and it comes in handy on the street sometimes when you stop on a hill. Let's pop the trunk and check out the fuel situation that I mentioned earlier. So back here we've got an Aeromotive 6-gallon fuel cell and its corresponding mounting bracket, which was not cheap. But again, I don't have a welder, so I wanted a clean bolt-in option, and this was the best I could find. It's got an in-tank 340 stealth pump, which is really just stealthy enough to let you know you're in a race car without being annoying. I added a generic fuel level sending unit after the fact, which was the closest one I could find to being the correct height for this cell. We've got a Fuel Lab inline filter as a backup to the in-tank sock filter on the pump. All the fuel lines were custom made by a company called Raceflux. I planned how I wanted the lines run, mocked it up with rope, measured everything, then built the hoses online with their custom hose builder tool, which is really slick. It lets you choose a type of hose, length, type of fitting at each end, and whether you want a fire sleeve and shrink tubing. Highly recommend if you need custom hoses. It's one of the few pieces of this build that fit perfectly without having to make any modifications. I do still have to pop the trunk to fill the cell, but now S1 Built makes a kit that uses the factory fill location, so eventually I'd like to convert to that. You're probably thinking 6 gallons sounds pretty small, and I agree, but it actually works just fine for what I use the car for. I don't daily this, I don't road trip it, I never really go more than an hour to an hour and a half away from home for car shows or meets, so it works just fine. On track days, I take an extra 5-gallon gas can with me and I can run laps all day and drive 45 minutes home, no problem. I can usually get about 120 miles of range out of this cell on the street before I start getting nervous. The fuel pressure regulator is a piston-style unit from Hybrid Racing, as I mentioned before, and I run a deadhead configuration to the fuel rail, which just means the feed line dead ends at the fuel rail, and the return line comes off the regulator where it's mounted on the shock tower, instead of mounting on the fuel rail. No advantage there other than packaging and looking really clean. I just didn't want a fuel line running around the belt side of the engine since that would have complicated the routing and used longer lines. The way it is now uses the shortest possible fuel lines. Okay, let's check out the interior. So the first thing that probably stands out is this roll bar, which is from Eimer Engineering. There are really only 2 mainstream options for bolt-in roll cages for this chassis, and those are Cusco and Autopower. But I didn't really like either of their available options. This is a 4-point bar, powder coated in a semi-matte black finish, which they let you choose from a whole catalog. I did a whole install video on this too, so go check that out if you're interested in what it took to install. It was a little tricky. I also added a little fire extinguisher here just in case things get too rowdy out on the track. The seat is a Sparco Grid Q on a PCI slider mount with a Sparco FIA 4-point competition harness. It took a little finagling to figure out the harness mounting on the center console side of the seat because there's no room over there to mount a ring to clip the harness onto. So I customized that side of the lap belt to use a bolt-in bracket instead of the clip-in style. Sticking with the Sparco theme, we've got quite literally the very first upgrade I ever did to this car, which is the Sparco R383 steering wheel, which I still love. It's on an NRG Shorty quick release in neochrome with matching neochrome mounting screws because that's what I wanted back in 2015 when I didn't know anything about cars. Throw a comment down if you still have your first ever mod on your car right now. I recently added a Circuit Hero steering wheel extension to bring the wheel in closer to me, which makes tracking the car way easier and has the added benefit of allowing me to see my gauge cluster again. Over in the middle here, we've got the K-tuned billet shifter and cables. I've seen a lot of mixed reviews from people on these, but I spent a lot of time adjusting this to get it just right, and I absolutely love it. I've got it set to the shortest throw setting, and combined with the stiffer detent springs, it just feels so rock solid and crispy. I was missing some shifts at the track every once in a while with the old Mugen shift knob I had, so I swapped in a Circuit Hero weighted knob and it changed my life. It's really the perfect combo right now in my opinion. For gauges, I made a custom mount panel from 1/8" ABS plastic and added coolant temp, oil pressure, and fuel level gauges from GlowShift. The factory fuel gauge on the dash just isn't accurate enough with the aftermarket fuel sending unit, and when you only have 6 gallons in the tank, you kinda need it to be accurate. Rounding out the interior, we've got this custom switch panel I made. Each switch controls a dedicated relay that I wired to a custom electrical panel I made and installed behind the glove box. Obviously, the radio and HVAC controls have been removed, along with the factory heater core and blower, which took up the whole space under the dash and never got used anyway. I've since added an aftermarket heater core with a spout fan and run some flex tubing to the factory dash air inlets, so I can run the car in the winter and have defrost and some heat. I did this because I recently started ice racing. It's a super simple system that hardly takes up any space and weighs a lot less than the factory system. If you're interested in how I did that, let me know in the comments and I'll make another video about it. I did have to add a booster pump to the coolant line that runs out of the head to the heater core because there just wasn't enough flow to keep the core hot without it, so that's controlled by one of the switches here too. In the summer, I can close the manual shutoff valve on the supply hose to prevent coolant flow to the heater core and still use the fan for air circulation when it's hot. The car never had AC anyway, so at least I'll have some airflow in the summer. There's just a few more things on the exterior before we get to the dyno sheet and the weigh-in, so let's check that out real quick. The winter wheel setup is these black Sparco Terras in 15x7, which I've always wanted to see on this car. I scoured the internet and I have yet to find a single photo of an EG on these wheels. I saw a couple of 8th gen Civics and Honda Fits running these, and I found the front half of an EK and a CRX with the logos removed, but that was the best I could do. Otherwise, this might be the only EG on the internet running these wheels, and I'm not sure why, because I think they look awesome. But wheels are all about your taste, so maybe I'm alone on this one. I'm running Blizzaks on these for the winter in 195/60 R15s. With the factory Honda mudguards, I think this setup goes pretty hard, but let me know what you think in the comments. The summer setup is pretty standard, matte black, raised graham lights in a 15x8, wrapped in Bridgestone Potenza RE71 RSs. Since it's all-wheel drive, we're running 225/50s all around, which is basically the widest tire you can run in the rear and results in some pretty insane grip levels on the track. Let's take a peek up front where we've got some aux beam driving lights I just installed, which I of course had to wire to a factory style fog light button on the dash since I had one laying around. Even though I'm running nice Sylvania bulbs, the headlights just don't put out the kind of light I want at night, so I figured I'd do some big yellow rally style fogs. We've got a Sparco toe strap, and I did these bumper block off plates to help prevent road spray from getting into the engine bay in the winter, but otherwise this just runs wide open in the summer. It just helps the engine heat up quicker when it's below freezing here. Obviously, this has to come off when it warms up, but it runs perfect in the winter just like this. I recently did a custom under tray too, made of 1/8 inch ABS plastic sheet, as well as an air filter block-off plate to help protect the bay and the filter from road spray. Since the filter is so close to the ground, it'll suck up water and try to drown itself if I hit a big enough puddle or if it's raining too hard. If you want to see what that looks like, check out this video in the corner. I just about hydrolocked it during a competition and it almost ended really bad. There are tons of finer details I left out in the interest of time because I could talk about this stuff for days, so drop a comment if you want to hear more on a specific area of the car. As promised, let's check out this dyno sheet. The car made 209 horsepower to the wheels at 8,300 RPM on the Heartbreaker dyno, which I was pleasantly surprised about. I assumed there would be more drivetrain power loss with the all-wheel drive system, but I think the torque number is kind of where you see that loss. 134 torques is more like K20A2 territory, so at least I have a little buffer with the higher compression K20A. This engine in factory form puts out 217 horsepower according to the interwebs, so I think 210 wheel is pretty good. As you can see, my tuner cut it just under the 8,400 RPM limiter to be safe, but the power curve shows no signs of stopping, so I don't think 217 is unrealistic with a little bit higher limiter.
Yeah, they made 210.
Granted, I don't know if that 217 Euro R number is crank or wheel horsepower, so if you know the answer, maybe throw it in the comments with your source. I'm always curious about that stuff. I don't have torque split numbers available from the dyno since it was a single eddy current Mustang roller, so you'd need a dual eddy current dyno like a Dynapack to measure torque at both the front and rear wheels separately. If you know of anyone who's done that, let me know in the comments. Myself and probably the rest of the internet would be super interested to see the power split. Now let's check out the weigh-in numbers. I had the car weighed by Impulse Performance, who brought their scales out to a track event. With a full tank, it came in at 2,311 pounds, which is still 50 pounds lighter than a stock Civic Si, so it certainly still handles like a lightweight. The weight distribution comes out to 63% front, 37% rear, which is a little more balanced than a K-swap in front-wheel drive configuration, since you have the extra all-wheel drive weight in the rear, so that's nice. In fact, the weight distribution of a factory spec Civic CX is 62 front, 38 rear, so mine is nearly identical to the original spec. The crossweights are decent at 52/48, but I'd like to get those dialed in a little better. Last but not least, here's the full parts list with every single aftermarket and non-stock part currently installed on the car. I've made this list public and linked to it in the description so you can peruse it on your own time if you're interested. I've included the totals for both parts and labor, but just know that some of the labor isn't totally necessary for an all-wheel drive build. One thing to note when looking at this list is that I got the rear differential and viscous coupler essentially for free. When I first started the build, I bought an entire RT 4-wheel drive Civic Wagovan for a steal, removed the parts from it, put a little TLC into it, and resold it in front-wheel drive configuration for essentially the same price. So you'd need to add $3,000 to $5,000 to the parts list to make it accurate for today's obscene prices on wagon parts. All in, we're looking at a little over $30,000 in parts and about $8,000 in shop labor for things I couldn't practically do myself. So to get it where it is today from scratch would take well over $40,000, not including the price of buying the car in the first place. Considering the fact that this is a very middle-of-the-road build, looking at this list certainly puts into perspective the exorbitant amount of money some of these higher-level builds require. It's not the cheapest way to build a Civic, but it's also certainly not the most expensive either. If anything, keeping track of the costs reminds me just how far this build has come in the past decade, and getting out there to see other people's builds always makes for an exciting but humbling experience. And the thing is, the price doesn't matter so much at the end of the day because for true enthusiasts like you and me, it's all about the experience. If someone came up to me today and offered me $40,000 for this car, I'd have to say no. So that brings us to the last thing. If you're trying to build an all-wheel drive Honda, or any car really, and you're a little overwhelmed by the price or the complexity or just how long it's taking, or feeling that FOMO when you see other people's builds, just remember, it didn't get built all at once. It's taken me nearly a decade to build this car, which comes out to just over $300 a month. So if you're just starting or you've been grinding on it for years like me, I just wanted to say, keep it up. The car enthusiast world needs you. If you made it this far, you're officially a Honda head, so thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do me a favor and give me a thumbs up on your way out, and consider subscribing if you haven't already. Catch you on the next one, and maybe I'll see you out there. Take it easy.